Betrayed by blood, the price of rejection. The first time I realized how different my life was from Mason's, I was 12 years old. We were in the kitchen like any other afternoon, but this time something would shift forever. Mason had been playing with the dog, one of those carefree moments that he seemed to always have when he accidentally spilled an entire box of cereal across the floor. A simple mistake. But to me, it was the beginning of everything. Our mother walked in, took one look at the mess, and without missing a beat, turned to me. "Why weren't you watching him?" she asked, her voice sharp, filled with a mix of disappointment and anger. I froze. It didn't matter that I was doing my homework at the dining table or that I hadn't even seen the mess happen. All that mattered was that it had happened and I was somehow to blame. I protested, tried to explain, but she wasn't listening. The lecture continued, louder now, until it ended with my grounding. That moment stayed with me, burned into my memory like a brand. Grounded for something that wasn't even my fault, punished for trying to mind my own business. I watched Mason, who barely got scolded, glide past the chaos he'd caused as if nothing had happened. It wasn't fair, but it was what always happened. As I got older, the unfairness became harder to ignore. Mason, my younger brother, seemed to live a charmed life. He could fail his classes, skip curfew without a word, talk back to our parents, and always get away with it. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs, kept my grades up, and even saved every penny to buy my first car. But no matter what I did, I was never the golden child. Mason was. He had an effortless way about him that made everyone around him, especially our parents, overlook his mistakes. But me? I was the problem child. Every small misstep, every minor imperfection was scrutinized. The resentment festered, but by the time I hit high school, I realized that speaking out wasn't worth it anymore. If I said anything, I risked being labeled difficult. So, I learned to stay silent, to keep my head down and do what I had to do. But deep down I was furious. It wasn't just the double standards. It was the feeling that no matter how hard I tried, it would never be enough. Not for them. Not for my family. At 18, Alex had imagined his birthday would mark a milestone. A celebration of independence, freedom, the start of adulthood. He had always been the responsible one, grinding away at school, balancing part-time jobs, and trying to make his parents proud. But that year, the celebration never came. Instead, it became the year everything unraveled. It started with something small, insignificant really. Mason had once again borrowed Alex's car without asking. And once again, he returned it with an empty gas tank. Alex had had enough. He walked into the living room where Mason was lounging, carefree as usual. "Seriously, Mason?" Alex said, voice tight with frustration. "You borrowed my car, and you didn't even bother to fill the tank?" Mason shrugged, his usual lazy smile plastered on his face. "Mom and Dad will give you gas money if you ask," he replied, as if it were the most casual thing in the world. That was it, the tipping point. Alex could feel his patience snapping. "If Mason wants to be treated like an adult, he needs to start acting like one," he blurted, standing tall in the living room. His words hung in the air, weighty and bold. For a moment, there was silence. But instead of the support or even a word of agreement, Alex's mother's face tightened with something unfamiliar. "You've been difficult lately," she said, her voice like ice, her tone laced with that passive-aggressive calm that Alex had come to dread. "Maybe it's time you learned what it's like to live on your own." Alex's mind went blank. "What?" he asked, unable to believe what he was hearing. "Your father, and I think it's time for you to go," she said flatly, as if it were nothing more than a suggestion. Alex froze, his heart pounding in his chest. His mother's words echoed in his ears, and it hit him with the force of a freight train. This was it. This was the moment. 2 weeks later, the reality set in. Alex came home from work one evening to find his room packed with boxes. His father stood in the doorway, arms crossed, a cold expression on his face. "You're 18 now," he said, voice devoid of emotion. "It's time to grow up." No explanation. No warning. No offer of help. Just an eviction notice. Alex stumbled through the next few weeks, couch surfing at friends' places, scraping together whatever he could to survive. It felt like a bad dream, but it was real. Meanwhile, Mason's life only seemed to get easier. Their parents were still financing his life, buying him a new car, paying for his tutoring, even sending him on vacations to places Alex could only dream of. And there he was, Alex, stuck in a tiny room with peeling wallpaper, barely enough to cover rent, all while trying to find his footing in the world. The irony of it all crushed him. Every time he saw pictures of Mason living the life Alex had always dreamed of, he couldn't help but feel the sting. But more than anger, he felt numb. Before I share what happened next, the moment that completely shattered Alex's understanding of family, I want to connect with you, my amazing viewers. Where are you watching from? Drop your country's flag in the comments below. And if you've ever had to fight for something you believe in, hit that like button because this story is just getting started. But in that numbness, something else happened. Alex realized something important. If his family didn't want him, fine. He didn't need them to survive. He wasn't going to let their rejection define him. He could build his own life. So, Alex threw himself into work. 2 jobs, long hours, minimal social life, but he didn't care. Every single day felt like a fight, but it was his fight. He remembered the nights when he'd stand outside that fancy restaurant, watching his family laugh, eat, and live a life he was no longer part of. The feeling of being an outsider, that pain, became his fuel. He wasn't going to let that be the story. Alex was going to write his own. Stay tuned, because the next chapter of the story will leave you breathless. Years passed. Alex's life, once dominated by hardship and struggle, had finally begun to take shape. He had a steady job that he was proud of, a small but cozy apartment that he had worked tirelessly to afford, and a handful of close friends who would become his new family. It wasn't perfect, but it was his life. His family, however, had remained a distant memory. The people who had cast him aside, the ones who had chosen Mason over him time and time again, seemed like ghosts from a past that was long forgotten. Meanwhile, Mason's life had continued on, carefree as always. His Instagram feed was a never-ending display of luxury vacations, new cars, and extravagant parties, all paid for by their parents. Alex never liked those posts, but he didn't block him. He couldn't. There was still a small, bitter part of him that was curious about the life he'd never had and the life Mason had always taken for granted. And then, one day, out of nowhere, a message from his mother popped up on his phone. It had been years since they'd last spoken. His heart skipped a beat as he read the text. "We need to talk. It's important." Alex stared at the screen, the words blinking back at him. The past 7 years of silence between them weighed heavily on his chest. He didn't want to care. He didn't want to open that door again. But a small part of him, the part that still held on to the faint hope that things could have been different, wanted to know what they had to say. He debated with himself for what felt like an eternity. Finally, against his better judgment, he agreed to meet her. The next day, Alex sat in a small, quiet diner, his eyes scanning the room. He didn't know what he expected, but seeing his mother walk in felt surreal. She looked older than he remembered. The once strong woman who had always held everything together now appeared fragile, her face etched with the unmistakable signs of age. Time had not been kind to her, and for a brief moment, Alex felt something close to pity. But that feeling was fleeting. She sat down across from him, and for a moment, neither of them said anything. Then she started. "Alex, we've been through a lot these past few years. Things haven't been easy." Her voice cracked slightly as she spoke, but Alex wasn't sure whether it was from regret or just the weight of her own situation. She went on, explaining how their business had collapsed, how bad investments and a series of unfortunate events had drained their savings. We're in a bad place, Alex," she said, her eyes meeting his for the first time in years. "We've lost everything. Our house, our savings, everything." She paused, her gaze dropping to the table as if she couldn't bear to look at him anymore. "And now we don't know where to turn. We were hoping we could stay with you, just until we get back on our feet." Alex felt the words hit him like a slap to the face. His mind raced, trying to process what he had just heard. Stay with him? The same people who had kicked him out when he was 18, who had chosen Mason over him every single time, now wanted his help? The irony was almost too much to bear. He couldn't stop the bitter laugh that escaped his lips. "You want to stay with me?" he asked, his voice shaking with disbelief. "After everything? After you chose Mason over me?" His mother's face fell, and for a brief moment, Alex saw something in her eyes that he hadn't seen in years: vulnerability. "We wouldn't ask if we had any other options," she said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "We've tried everything else. Mason, he's not in a position to help us." Alex blinked, not sure if he had heard her correctly. "What?" He could barely bring himself to speak. "Mason can't help? That's funny because he's always been the one you took care of." He's always had everything handed to him on a silver platter. So, now he's not in a position to help. The anger started to rise in his chest, but he swallowed it down. His mother looked away, her hands trembling slightly. Mason, he's struggling too. Things aren't as easy for him anymore. But we can't turn to anyone else, Alex. Please. Her voice cracked at the end, and for a brief moment, Alex could almost feel the weight of her desperation. For a moment, he said nothing. His mind was a blur, 1,000 thoughts crashing together, each one more painful than the last. The overwhelming sense of betrayal gnawed at him. How dare they? After everything he'd been through, after all the years they had ignored him, now they wanted him to take them in? Felt like a cruel joke. But despite everything, Alex couldn't just turn his back. A part of him, maybe the part that was still holding on to the faint hope of a family, wanted to help. But another part of him, the one that had spent years building a life without them, knew he couldn't let them back in without a price. I need to think about it, Alex said, standing up abruptly. His words hung heavy in the air. He didn't want to make a rash decision, not yet. His mind was racing, torn between guilt and anger. But he knew one thing for sure. Whatever decision he made, it couldn't be about saving them. It had to be about him. Without another word, Alex left the diner, his heart heavy with the weight of the choices he'd have to make. The past wasn't something you could just forget, and now it seemed it was back to haunt him. Over the next few days, Alex found himself wrestling with a decision that wasn't as simple as just helping his parents. It wasn't just about the roof they needed. It was about the years of pain, the years of rejection, and the life he had spent building on his own, piece by piece, without them. The weight of everything that had happened. The years of being overlooked, the time he'd spent in that tiny apartment, the loneliness, crushed him with every passing hour. His friends tried to offer advice, but none of it made the decision any easier. Leo, one of his closest friends, didn't hold back. They didn't care about you when you needed them, Leo said, his words sharp. Why should you care about them now? Alex sat with that for a long time, staring at the walls of his apartment, feeling the familiar sting of abandonment, wondering whether it was really worth it. Could he just forgive everything they had done? Could he open the door to the people who had rejected him when he was vulnerable? The answer wasn't clear. And then, just as he thought he might reach some clarity, the phone rang. It was Mason, the same Mason who had always had it easy, the one who had always been their favorite. Alex almost didn't want to pick up, but something in him, something that still hoped for closure, made him answer. Hey, Sam, Mason said, his voice sounding different, almost sheepish. Mom said you agreed to help them. Alex felt his heart tighten. He didn't hesitate. I didn't agree to anything, he snapped, his words firm, not giving an inch. Mason's tone shifted, almost defensive. Well, they're counting on you, he said, almost pleading. Alex paused, the anger rising in his chest like an untamed wave. That was the moment it hit him, the moment he realized nothing had changed. His family still expected him to clean up their messes. They still expected him to be the one to fix things, even after everything they had put him through. He wasn't just angry anymore. He was done. The next few hours were a blur as Alex turned the situation over in his mind. The past few years had been a battle. He'd fought for every inch of his freedom, for his own stability. And now they wanted to take that from him. The truth was clear now. His family had no right to expect anything from him. Finally, after all the thinking, Alex knew exactly what to do. He didn't want to be part of their drama anymore. Didn't want to be pulled back into that toxic cycle. He grabbed his phone and sent a short, to-the-point message to his mother. You should talk to Mason. I'm sure he'll figure something out. He pressed send without hesitation. And then, for the first time in years, he blocked her number. There would be no more running back to him for help. No more pretending that things could go back to how they were. A week passed, and just as Alex had expected, the knock on his door came. It was Grayson, his brother, the golden child, standing there, looking lost, almost like a stranger. I need a place to stay, Grayson said, his voice carrying a tone of desperation that Alex had never heard before. Alex didn't flinch this time. "Why don't you take them in?" he asked, his words sharp, biting. "You're their favorite, right?" Grayson didn't have an answer. He just stood there, shifting uncomfortably, but eventually he stayed. It didn't take long for Alex to realize, though, that nothing had changed. Grayson was just as selfish as he had always been, just as careless and entitled. Grayson needed someone to solve his problems, just like their parents always did. In the end, Alex made the decision. He wasn't the one to fix his family's brokenness anymore. He wasn't the one to pick up the pieces of their wreckage. He helped his parents find a place to stay, a rundown rental property in a part of town that barely passed as livable. "It's the best I can do," he told them, his voice even, emotionless. They weren't happy, of course. They complained about the state of the place, about how it wasn't up to their standards. But there was nothing more to say. They couldn't argue. As for Grayson, he was gone again soon after, leaving Alex with nothing but the cold, hard truth. This life, the one he had built on his own, was his. It was his choice, his responsibility, and it wasn't going to be controlled by anyone anymore. For the first time in years, Alex felt a strange sense of peace settle over him. He had come through it all. He had fought for his independence, for his dignity, and for his right to live life on his own terms. His family would no longer be a part of that story. They had made their choices. Now it was time for him to make his, and he was finally free.